Hey, what's up guys? So the pre-patch is finally here, and that means it's finally time to relearn how Enhancement Shaman works once again. So the main changes that Enhancement Shaman got was that they got rid of Rockbiter, they replaced our Maelstrom with something new called Maelstrom Weapon, we now have Wind Fury Totem back, we have Weapon Imbues back, and of course we got lots of talent changes. So let me go over Maelstrom Weapon real quick. So what Maelstrom Weapon does is it's a buff that stacks up to 10 stacks, and for every stack you have, you reduce the cast time of your next Chain Lightning, Lightning Bolt, or Healing Surge, or Chain Heal by 20%, and you increase the damage by 20%. You can consume up to 5 stacks, so it's not like you can stack it up to 10 and then do 200% more damage. But if you stack it up to 5 stacks, you use, for example, Lightning Bolt, it will do double the damage and it will be instant cast. So now that's out of the way, let's go over the talents. So for the first row, we have Lashing Flames, Forceful Winds, and Elemental Blast. Forceful Winds is the same, but let's go over Lashing Flames first. So Lashing Flames makes it so whenever you Lava Lash, it increases the damage of your Flame Shock on the target by 100% for 12 seconds. On a single target, you can pretty much keep this up constantly, so it's just a 100% buff to Flame Shock, which is really big. Then Forceful Winds is the same as it was before. Wind Fury causes each successive Wind Fury attack within 15 seconds to increase the damage of Wind Fury by 50%, stacking up to 5 times. On AoE, you're pretty much gonna have this full stacks most of the time, but this is mainly for AoE. Then we have Elemental Blast, which it's a nice ability. It interacts with our Maelstrom Weapon, as in it will make it instant cast and double the damage if we have 5 stacks of Maelstrom Weapon. But the issue with it is it has a 12-second cooldown, which means you have to pretty much make sure you have your Maelstrom Weapon stacks ready every single time Elemental Blast comes off cooldown. And when you have to play around this too much, you might actually be losing DPS, because the whole thing with Maelstrom Weapon right now is that you kind of play around it to make sure that you never overcap stacks, but at the same time you don't use it constantly when it comes up, when it goes to 5 stacks, just because otherwise you would run out of globals. So for single target, Lashing Flames is the option, just 100% damage buff to Flame Shock, and for AoE, Forceful Winds is the option because you can't really keep up Lashing Flames or Flame Shock for that matter up on AoE, and I'll explain you why in a few talents. And Elemental Blast, right now I wouldn't pick it at all because the other options are just way better. Then the second row, Storm Flurry, Hot Hand, Ice Strike. What Storm Flurry does is whenever you Storm Strike, you have a 25% chance to strike the target an additional time for 40% of its damage, and this effect can chain off of itself, which is really strong. One special interaction with this is when you use Crash Lightning, and then you Storm Strike, every single overload of the Storm Strike will do the extra damage you get from Crash Lightning. So when you Crash Lightning multiple mobs, for 12 seconds you get a buff that whenever you cast Storm Strike or Lava Lash, you will deal a certain amount of damage to all the mobs in front of you, which means that because Storm Flurry's damage is only 40% of normal damage, this is actually really strong, as in, even if it doesn't hit very hard, you will hit all the mobs for the same amount anyway. So 2 overloads can basically be the damage of Crash Lightning AoE from like 2 Lava Lashes or 2 Storm Strikes, which would be self-cast. Then you have Hot Hand, which makes it so melee auto attacks with Flame Tongue weapon active have a 5% chance to reduce the cooldown of Lava Lash by 75% and increase the damage of Lava Lash by 100% for 8 seconds. This is very strong, but the issue with it is that it's very inconsistent. It's only 5% chance, and also if it procs just when you have to move, it really suffers from having downtime. So you could have it proc just as you're like moving away from a boss, and that's a completely wasted buff. Because it's kind of RNG how often you get it or when it procs, it's not great. It can be really amazing on single target if it procs all the time, but it's very inconsistent. Then Ice Strike, when you do Ice Strike, you do damage, you snare them, doesn't really matter for PvE that much. But successful Ice Strikes reset the cooldown of your Flame Shock and Frost Shock spells. This can actually be kind of strong for AoE, and it will also allow you to spread your Flame Shock easier. But in general, if you play Enhancement properly, you usually don't really have the globals for this. Like, you could make a global for this by prioritizing it over something else, but it's not really worth. It's also kind of annoying, in my opinion, to use just because Flame Shock, it's a 4.8 second cooldown for me right now. If I would want to make value out of Ice Strike, I would have to Flame Shock instantly Ice Strike and then Flame Shock again. Because if I would wait 2 globals, by that time it's nearly off cooldown again and it's not really worth it. So here I would always go for Storm Flurry for both single target and AoE. Now the third row, it's pretty much your choice. Static Charge, good in dungeons. Earth Shield, I wouldn't really take it, it's personal choice, maybe for PvP. And Spirit Wolf is just my default personally because it's a free damage reduction. Let's say for example on Mythic N'Zoth, if everything is dead and you just go in Spirit Wolf and Ghost Wolf just waiting around, you get a 20% damage reduction, which is pretty strong. Then next row, a pretty big row. Elemental Assault, Storm Strike damage is increased by 15% and Storm Strike now generates 1 stack of Maelstrom weapon. This really makes the rotation feel a lot more fluent on single target because you get a lot more Maelstrom. Then we have Hailstorm, which each stack of Maelstrom weapon consumed increases the damage of your next Frost Shock by 35% and causes your next Frost Shock to hit 1 additional target per Maelstrom weapon stack consumed. Which means if you cast any spell with Maelstrom weapon, for example Chain Lightning, and you use 5 stacks, you will then, with the next Frost Shock you do, hit 6 enemies and the damage will be buffed by, I think, 175%. Let me show you how it works actually. So let's generate some Maelstrom weapon. Okay. Oh, I'm not tracking my Maelstrom weapon yet on my bars, it seems. Okay, so now I will consume this. I get 5 stacks of the talent. Then if I now use Frost Shock, I hit all of these targets for quite a bit of damage. So this is actually a really nice choice for AoE. Then we have Fire Nova. During the entirety of beta, Fire Nova has had a big problem where it's pointless to play with. It's a really cool ability, as in like, if you remember Warlords of Draenor, this ability was the shit. It was actually kind of overpowered, but it was really fun to use. Now the problem is they brought Fire Nova back, but we have no way of spreading our Flame Shocks. And on AoE, generally, you don't really have many globals. You don't really want to be spreading Flame Shock. And if a pool is very short, by the time you have a few Flame Shocks up, your Fire Nova, like the mobs will probably be dead, and your Fire Nova won't do much. So it has a super long setup time, it's annoying to use, it has a 12-second cooldown, so in general, I would never ever take this. Unless they change something that we can spread Flame Shock, I would never take this. So, in general, single target, Elemental Assault, really strong. AoE, I would go for Hailstorm. It's a bit more difficult to play, but once you get used to it, it's really fun. Then next row, it's really whatever you prefer. If you need a group movement speed, you go Windrush Totem. If you just want to get to the boss faster, or like you need to jump around a lot, Feral Lunge can be nice. If you want some survivability, Nature's Guardian can be nice. Like on a boss, you don't have to move much. So it really depends on the situation. I wouldn't say that personally I take one over the other usually, but I guess most of the time I take either Windrush or... it's hard to say. Like, everything has its uses, so... I would say just think about the fight you're doing, the content you're doing, and choose accordingly. Now, the next row, Crash Lightning. Whenever you Crash Lightning, it electrifies the ground, leaving an electrical field, which damages enemies for over 6 seconds. Not very strong, not gonna lie, because you have Stormkeeper as well, which... When you use it, your next lightning bolt, your next 2 lightning bolts or chain lightnings deal 150% more damage and can be instant cast. This can be really strong, you can hit very hard with this, but in general, the winner of all of this is Sundering. 40-second cooldown, whenever you use it, you deal quite a bit of damage, and you incapacitate enemies for 2 seconds, which means in Mythic Plus especially, or even like adds on bosses, whenever you use this, everything gets interrupted, which is pretty damn big. So for this row, I would generally never go Crashing Storm. If you're going on AoE, I would go Sundering. On single target, I would probably go Sundering as well. But Stormkeeper, however, does have its uses on single target, especially if paired with Earn and Spike. The one issue I have with it, kind of, is Stormkeeper itself, the cast, will consume your Maelstrom charges. Which means that if you're at 5 stacks of Maelstrom weapon, like, honestly, this should just be instant cast in my ability, but if you're at 5 stacks of Maelstrom weapon, it will consume all the 5 stacks to make it instant cast on a 1.2 second cast. Which is... it kind of feels bad, because it's not really buffing the damage of Stormkeeper, since it's not a damaging ability, but it is what it is. Then, one more note, when you use the Lightning Bolt, which is already instant cast from Stormkeeper, your Maelstrom weapon stacks will still add to the damage. So you will do more than 150% more damage, but let me show you. let me get some stacks of Maelstrom Weapon. I'll go to 10 because then I can consume the 5 on the Stormkeeper and then I can consume the other 5 on Lightning Bolt. Okay, I have 10. So now I will use Stormkeeper and then Lightning Bolt. Even though it didn't consume the Maelstrom Weapons charges, it still adds to the damage. And then I can do another Lightning Bolt, which is pretty buffed as well. Like you can see, Lightning Bolts, it crit for 8.3k, which is pretty significant. But in general, for most uses, I would still go Sundering. It's just so much easier to use. And yeah, that's about it. Then for the last row, Elemental Spirits, Earth and Spike, Ascendance. Let me go over Earth and Spike and Ascendance first, because those are the easy ones. Earth and Spike, it's a 20-second cooldown. When you use it, you'll deal some damage. And then all your physical and nature damage you deal to the target is increased by 20% for 10 seconds. So physical and nature, your Storm Strike is physical, and your Lightning Bolts and Chain Lightnings are nature. And also your Crash Lightning is also nature damage. So those are the things it buffs. In general, Earth Spike can be useful. The one issue with it is right now as well, essences, they still exist. So pairing Guardian of Azeroth, for example, with Ascendance, which is the exact same cooldown, is going to give you a lot more benefits than when you pick Earth Spike, because Earth Spike doesn't really line up. So right now, even though you can do high burst with Stormkeeper and Earth Spike, I would not pick Earth Spike right now in the pre-patch. Then we have Ascendance, which it's slightly changed as well, if you haven't been paying attention to the beta. But basically, it works like before, where you turn into an Air Ascendant for 15 seconds, and then it reduces the cooldown and the cost of your Storm Strike by 60%. I don't know why it says cost. I guess it will reduce the mana cost, which it used to cost Maelstrom, I guess. That's why it says cost as well, but it doesn't really do much. And it transforms your auto attacks and Storm Strike into wind attacks, which bypass armor and have 30-yard range. So basically, your auto attacks and your wind strikes will become ranged abilities, which is pretty damn cool, and it will bypass armor. So it will just do more damage. In general, this is probably what you want to play with, especially since it pairs up well with Guardian of Azeroth. And then it also has the added effect, when you use it, you deal a certain amount of nature damage to all the enemies within 8 yards. So even on AoE, it has its uses now. Plus, it's still in the global cooldown, but because it deals damage when you press it, it actually doesn't feel that bad. Then we have Elemental Spirits, which reduces the cooldown of Feral Spirits by 30 seconds, and it causes your Feral Spirits to be imbued with Fire, Frost, or Lightning, enhancing your abilities. So when you do Feral Spirits, you spawn 2 spirits, 2 completely random spirits, and every single buff does completely different things. So I'm not going to explain to you what the buffs do exactly. You should look those up on Icy Veins or any other guide, written guide. But the thing with it is, if you cast Elemental Spirits and you get 2 wolves, which are pretty bad, your damage is going to suffer. If, however, you get 2 wolves that are pretty good, your damage is going to be great. But it's super RNG, and personally, even though the ability is kind of nice, I wouldn't pick it right now, as in, like, it's just way too RNG. One note about this, they did say they will change how Elemental Spirits works. I don't know how exactly. I don't know if they're going to give you 1 wolf of each element to reduce remove the RNG or whatever, but they did say they will change it. In general, out of this row, I explained Earth and Spike, explained the Elemental Spirits. I would always go with Ascendance. It really lines up well with your essences. Plus, single target, it's nice. AoE, it's nice. Personally, at least in the beta, I wasn't a massive fan of it because I usually had so much other things to press anyway. But yeah. So let's recap. For single target, this is the build you probably want to go for. And for AoE, you probably want to go for this build. Now let's get into the rotation. Now for the rotation, it's kind of hard to explain exactly all of the situations. If you want to know the best rotation in terms of like the exact priority list, I would suggest going to Icy Veins. Because WordUp makes the guide there, and he puts a lot of work and effort into making sure that it's correct. He does a lot of theory crafting, stuff like that. So if you want it written down, then it would be best to go to Icy Veins and put it on a second monitor or something, or go over it multiple times. But I will still show you how to do it. So the general idea is you want to make sure that you're never out of things to cast. And the way you do this is, if you remember Maelstrom Weapon, when you get 5 stacks, you can do an instant cast Lightning Bolt. The way you do this is by playing around this a little bit. So if you're at 5 stacks of Maelstrom Weapon and you have something different to press, you want to press something different, if that makes any sense. However, if you get to 8 stacks of Maelstrom Weapon, then you want to prioritize casting that Lightning Bolt or that Chain Lightning, depending on if it's single target or AoE, over casting your other abilities, because you don't want to overcap on Maelstrom either. So the rotation ends up being playing around with your Maelstrom stacks, basically. So the first thing you want to do before you go into combat is check your weapon buffs. I will still make a weak roll for them, I don't have it right now. But because weapon imbues are back and they're pretty big, make sure you apply them. So make sure I apply them. Then make sure you apply Lightning Shield as well. And then the first thing you have to do before combat, which you have to remember, it's going to take some getting used to, but Wind Fury Totem, it's a thing, so make sure you actually put it up. And then because we have Lashing Flames, the first thing we want to do is make sure we have it up on the mob, and then the priority after is casting Flame Shock. So if I engage the mob, I have Wind Fury up, I will Lava Lash, and then Flame Shock. Then the next priority, as usual, is Storm Strike. Storm Strike will always be one of the top things on the priority. The only things that are above the priority of Storm Strike is basically keeping Wind Fury Totem up, keeping Flame Shock up, and keeping Lava Lash up. But other than that, Storm Strike is usually at the top of the priority list, especially on single target here with Elemental Assault. And Storm Flurry, it's very, very strong and it's very important. Then when our Storm Strike is on cooldown, we can cast Feral Spirits, which is one of our cooldowns, which will basically, it will also give us Maelstrom instantly. And then every 3 seconds, every 3 seconds, it will give us 1 stack of Maelstrom. It lasts for 15 seconds, so in general, it will give 5 stacks of Maelstrom. Then the next thing on the priority list is Sundering. Straightforward. It's a pretty big damaging ability, 40-second cooldown, so you want to make sure you get it off on the cooldown. Then the next one is making sure you keep Flame Shock active, as in like the first priority of Flame Shock if it's not applied. If it's not applied, it should become your top priority. If it is applied, but it's about to run out, and you don't have Storm Strike to press, you don't have Sundering to press, you don't have Feral Spirits to press, then you want to reapply it. Then another thing you'll probably have to get used to is Frost Shock, because Frost Shock is above Lava Lash in the priority list. Usually you'd have Storm Strike first and then Lava Lash second. But Frost Shock actually does a decent amount of damage, so we actually put it in the priority list and it goes just above Lava Lash. So let me show you from the start now. I have my Wind Fury Totem up, I have my buffs up here on the top right. Lava Lash, Flame Shock, Storm Strike, Wolves, Sundering, then Frost Shock, and then Lava Lash. And then I have this up again. This is not taking into account Maelstrom. I'll go over Maelstrom now. So you see I'm at 10 stacks of Maelstrom right now. If it ever goes to 8 or higher, it should become your top priority. Just below Wind Fury Totem. But in general, like if you're like in range or something, I would say it could go above it even. Like if you're at 8 or more stacks, well, if you're at 10 stacks, it should be your top priority. If you're at 8 stacks, then Wind Fury Totem takes priority still. But just make sure, if it's 8 stacks or higher, that you cast that Lightning Bolt, because you do not want to overcap on Maelstrom weapon. So on a single target, not counting any cooldowns or talents, the priority is as follows. If you're at 8 stacks or more of Maelstrom weapon, you make sure you cast that Lightning Bolt or Chain Lightning or whatever. You just make sure you get rid of the stacks, because you don't want to overcap when you get to 10. Then the next priority is making sure on a single target you have this debuff up from Lava Lash. So you would apply Lava Lash. Then the next priority is making sure you have Flame Shock up. So Flame Shock should always be up. Then Storm Strike is below that. Then Flame Shock is in the priority list again, but only if you have 5 seconds or less. If you have 5 seconds or less on the debuff remaining. So now I would, because when you refresh it when it's 5 seconds or less, you probably already know, but it will add that remaining duration to the new Flame Shock. So you don't waste any globals that you could otherwise spend on different things. And then after Flame Shock is up and you don't have Storm Strike available, then you go for Frost Shock, which you'll have to get used to. Then it's Lava Lash. And then it's Crash Lightning. And then lowest priority in the rotation is then actually using your Maelstrom weapon stacks on Lightning Bolt. So it's very tricky, as in like, if you're at 8 or more stacks of Maelstrom weapon, it becomes your top priority. If you're at 5 or more, or if you're like below 8, then it's your lowest priority. Then everything else takes priority. Once you get used to this, and also once you get used to weaving in your frost shocks and stuff, you shouldn't have too much downtime, because a lot of people sometimes complain, oh, I'm playing Enhancement Shaman, but I have a lot of downtime. That's because you're playing it wrong. If you prioritize the correct things, you'll most likely not have any downtime. So now I'm gonna probably not stalk and just try to do the rotation for a bit, so you can see what I mean. Anyway, let's get into it. So make sure my buffs are up. Wind Fury Totem. Then also pay attention to these stacks. I might have to get used to it as well because I haven't played beta for a while. But anyway, let's get into it. Okay, so as you could probably see, I actually made a fair amount of mistakes. Like you saw my Maelstrom weapon go to 10, which should never happen. You probably also saw me not using Frost Shock on cooldown. But in general, I had fairly little downtime, doing the rotation fairly well. Once you get really used to it and you make sure you always cast correct abilities, always make sure you cast Frost Shock in front of Lava Lash and Crash Lightning and stuff like that, then I'm 99% sure you shouldn't really have downtime unless you're very, very unlucky. Now, let me explain Ascendance real quick, because there's one change that happens when you pop Ascendance. Ascendance is your highest priority, as in like it's below keeping Wind Fury up, but it's still your highest priority, as in like Wind Fury will most of the time be up anyway. But when you cast Ascendance, let me just cast it real quick. See, anytime I have Wind Strike, it becomes a top priority over everything. Even if you don't have the buff for Flame Shock, even if you don't have Flame Shock up, it becomes a top priority. Usually you will keep it up anyway, Flame Shock, because you can see like I have like 2 seconds in between every cast. But yeah, when you cast Ascendance, that becomes your top priority. Now, once you actually pop every cooldown on pull, it will probably get pretty hectic. Because right now we have a lot of stats. We don't have Corruption anymore, but we have a lot of stats. Guardian of Azeroth, it gives you a haste buff, if I'm correct. Yeah, 2% haste up to 5 times, so you get 10% haste from that. Then you get your Feral Spirits, which will give you Maelstrom weapon charges, which will make it stack even further. Then you have your Bloodlust, which increases your haste even more. And then if you have Ascendance, then you also have like Storm Strike, aka Wind Strike, up most of the time. Which means that on pull, it's probably going to take quite a bit of getting used to, because you'll have so many things to press. And if you're not used to knowing which ones you have to press in which order or which priority, then you will probably fuck up. But that's okay, because it's not easy. Like, Enhancement became, from spamming Stormstrike, a class that spams Stormstrike, spams one ability, 60% of our damage is one ability, it became one of the more complicated classes, especially with a lot of haste. So if you are fucking up on the rotation, don't feel bad. Like, even though I played beta quite a bit, like you just saw me do the rotation, I fucked up a fair amount. So if you want to practice, I would suggest going to a dummy, opening up Icy Veins, checking the written guide, and just practicing. Like, getting used to it. Getting used to casting that Frost Shock in your rotation. Getting used to Frost Shock being priority over Lava Lash and Crash Lightning. Also getting used to the fact that your Frost Shock will put both of your shocks on cooldown. So for example, if your Flame Shock has 2 seconds left, you have Storm Strike up and you cast Storm Strike, that you make sure you get that Flame Shock off. You don't cast the Frost Shock, because if you cast the Frost Shock, you won't be able to reapply your Flame Shock. Stuff like that. Anyway, let's now go into the AoE rotation because it becomes a little bit different since you have Hailstorm and you no longer have to keep your Flame Shock up. On AoE, Flame Shock kind of becomes a non-issue, as in you'll probably most likely never cast it. You will most likely not even have time to cast anything, really, like any shock, if you don't have Hailstorm, I mean. Like, because you'll generate so many charges that you'll probably just be pressing all the other buttons. But you should be running with Hailstorm, so let me explain how the rotation works then. The priority... Whoa, that's not what I wanted to press. The priority here becomes making sure your Frost Shock becomes your highest priority if you have the stacks of, what's it called? Hailstorm. Because on AoE, ideally, you will cast your Frost Shock on cooldown, because it does a lot of damage. You really want to make sure you cast your Frost Shock on cooldown. So the second you get these stacks, Frost Shock becomes your top priority. Then Sundering is the second in priority because obviously it does a lot of AoE damage. And Feral Spirits as your cooldown is always pretty high up. Now on AoE, you don't really want to do the same thing with Maelstrom Weapon as you do on single target, because the reason you do it on single target is to make sure you don't run out of globals. On AoE, you'll probably get so many things to hit that you probably will never run out of globals. So on AoE, the priority was, like I said, Frost Shock if you have the 5 Hailstorm charges, then Sundering, then your Spirit Wolves, which is cooldown, so it doesn't matter too much. But then your next priority becomes your Chain Lightning if you have 5 stacks of Maelstrom Weapon. Then after that, it's Crash Lightning if it's off cooldown, and then it's Storm Strike. Storm Strike is fairly low on the priority list because all the other abilities do AoE. Storm Strike does do AoE if you cast Crash Lightning before, but the other ones just have more priority. And then if you really don't have anything else available, then you can cast Lava Lash. Now there's one important thing that you have to know about Chain Lightning. When you Chain Lightning, if it hits more than one target, each target hit by your Chain Lightning increases the damage of your next Crash Lightning by 20%. This is also why Crash Lightning is kind of fairly high. As in, you will hit 3 targets, you will increase the damage of your next Crash Lightning by 60%, which is quite a bit. If you know Enhancement Shaman, when you do Crash Lightning, you do a hit on all the enemies in front of you. Which means, because of our Maelstrom Weapon, that we have a pretty high chance of generating quite a bit of Maelstrom. Which means we can then use that Maelstrom again for Chain Lightning, and so on. And now, when you add Hailstorm to the mix, it becomes, you would do Crash Lightning, you get a ton of Maelstrom, you do Chain Lightning, you get 5 Maelstrom weapon stacks, hopefully, and then you do your Frost Shock, and you just keep repeating that over and over. You keep doing the Crash Lightning, Chain Lightning, Frost Shock. So let me show you real quick. I hope I don't press anything wrong, because I moved buttons around since we have different abilities now. Like, for example, my Frost Shock is number 3, it used to be Storm Strike, so... Okay, let's see how it goes. So, we don't have the 5 stacks of Maelstrom, so Sundering becomes the highest priority, then the Spirit Wolves, then Crash Lightning, and then we try to do the loop-de-loop, where we Crash Lightning, Chain Lightning, Frost Shock, Crash Lightning, Chain Lightning, Frost Shock, ideally. This is actually very unlucky, like, not getting any charges. And I also don't want to really use a Shock as a filler, because if I use a Shock as a filler, I might not have it ready for Frost Shock, and you really don't want to delay Frost Shock. Like, it does so much damage that it's very important, okay? Okay, the server is lagging a lot, it's completely stuck. But you can see, like, once you kind of get it going, it just becomes a situation where you Crash Lightning, Chain Lightning, Frost Shock, Sundering in between when it's up, and you use your Storm Strike as a filler, and if you really have to, you use your Lava Lash as a filler. But usually with average luck, you should be able to have something to cast at all times. Now for the essences, you probably want to run with something like this, mainly because this, for your major essence, this lines up perfectly with your Ascendance. And then these 3 is just, it's a numbers game, like it doesn't really mean anything. One big note, if you have Memory of Lucid Dreams in here, remove it, because what it says is your spells and abilities have a chance to refund 50% of mana spent on them, heal you for blah blah blah, increase versatility. It's useless. because we're Enhancement Shamans. It used to refund Maelstrom, which was really strong if we used a specific talent, which everyone used, but now it's completely useless. So make sure you get this off your bar. I would just replace it with Crucible of Flame. These things may or may not change over the next few days because the simulations are not out yet. But in general, if you have these, I would run with this setup for now. For your stat weights, you probably want to simulate yourself on raid bots and check what your stat weights are. The one thing right now is the simulations might not be 100% correct yet. They might be unstable. So if you simulate yourself now, pretty soon after the video comes out, they might not 100% be correct, and they will improve over the next few days or weeks. But this is what my stat weights are right now. Let me show you. For me for example, for single target, I want less haste, mastery, more versatility, crit, basically. That's also partially because I have quite a bit of haste, so I want less haste, stuff like that. Yeah, you want to simulate yourself, and those will be the values. Anyway, that was it for the guide. If you have any more questions, or if I got something wrong, just tell me in the comments, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. For the rotation, like I said, go to Icy Veins, check out what's written down, and use that to practice, because it really takes a while to get used to. Especially because you have to weave in some new abilities. We have a new system called Maelstrom Weapon. We have Hailstorm on AoE, which changes everything. We're basically playing a different class than we were playing a few days ago, or like last patch. So anyway, thanks for watching, have an awesome day, and I'll hope to see you next video.